Okay, good morning. So the topic of my talk today is about violence, images of violence in late medieval Germany, which are actually quite formulation of late medieval art. And I prepared a talk about the range of association that can be used for understanding such imagery. So violent imagery in monumental medieval art was generally subordinated to an allegorical interpretive framework. Do you hear me? Yeah, it's okay? No? Okay, so do I have to use this? It's function? It functions?
Let's go, right?
Let's go to that letters, yeah. Okay, it's better? Great. So violence imagery in monumental medieval art was generally subordinated to an allegorical interpretive framework, combating monsters, warring knights, the tortures of the damned in hell, and other. Such representations focused either on the moment of moral struggle of conflicting ideologies, or on the triumph of death that existed in a symbolic order. Martyr cycles, however, tended to be more comprehensive and literal, unfolding the entire life of their protagonists from their preachings or miracle working through their persecution, execution, to their afterlife in paradise. How do I move on? Okay. While earlier studies of late medieval violence imagery have focused mainly on such allegorical representations, today I would like to engage with what seems to be a monumental public art of violence per se. 14th century violence imagery reveal a non-narrative series of immediate violence, all stages of decapitation, split skulls, severed limbs, and mutilated organs, all demonstrating submission rather than triumph of death. These images, which have seldom been scrutinized, will serve here as a springboard for preliminary reflection on the problems of image theory, reception, visual discourse of late medieval violence. I will demonstrate how, on the one hand, the new and drastic violent imagery is related to the realities of the juridical processes and public executions, and, on the other hand, to devotional practices. In a broader sense, I shall argue that during the period violence appeared for the first time in the Middle Ages as moral problem in theological, legal, and philological writings, and that violent imagery partakes in the same cultural discourse on the limits of violence and bodily integrity. So just a very short introduction to the work that we are going to see. This is the Holy Cross Minster in Schwäbisch Gmünd. It is in Swabia. Is one of the most prominent milestones of late Gothic architecture and sculpture. At the beginning of the 14th century, its old Romanesque structure has been intended to be replaced by a Gothic basilica. Yet already during the 30s, the plan was abandoned in favor of a Gothic hall church, which became a paradigm of the German particular Gothic known as Deutsche Sondergotik. Although it is uncertain at which stage of execution the renowned master of Cologne, Heinrich Parler, the Parler family actually shaped the entire urban landscape of Europe during the 14th century, the entire city of Prague, Vienna, Milan, and so forth. So Heinrich Parler it is not known when he was summoned to the city, but we learn about his activity from several sources, such as the city annals, his gravestones, and other. The sculptured north portal of the church features the Passion of Christ in a vivid narrative, really a unique one. It begins on the left with the agony of Christ, who is depicted praying, kneeling in an open landscape, asking his Father to have mercy on him. His face is raised upwards and out of the frame. The composition is thus open up to a space beyond the relief, implying a direct interaction with the viewers. To the right, yeah, it's your right, are the disciples who have fallen asleep, resting against the garden fence. The next episode is the betrayal by Judas. Several soldiers fashionably dressed approach Jesus from the right as Judas signifies his Lord by a kiss. Peter on the left, his hand now broken, cut off Malchus' ears, as concomitantly Christ heals and restores it to its place. Here. The events are composed in a fast rhythm. One action follows the other, and yet the distinction between the different moments remain clear. The freestanding figures are carved in the round, positioned on the stage. No one figure conceals another, thus making the narrative easily discernible from spectators' level. The narrative continues with the Pilatus trial scene, washing his hand and cleaning them from guilt, the flagellation, culminating in the second register with the crowning of Christ with thorns, the Via Dolorosa, the crucifixion, and a rather seldom depicted episode in sculptured portals, the descent here from the cross in a Pietà-like composition. Here this is the dead Christ received by Mary. The passion in mood reflects an inclination towards narrativity, moving sense and tangibility of action. It familiarizes the sacred history and relates it directly to the quotidian life of the spectators. The selection of scenes emphasizing Christ's humiliation and the allusion to the Pietà all suggest the dependence of the program upon the popular meditation on the life of Christ and the affective piety that encourage the viewers to identify themselves with the suffering of Christ and imitate it on their own bodies. Proceeding to the outer vaults, however, these qualities receive a radical shift, abandoning the narrative impulse and devotional sensitivity in favor of stark violence. 18 martyr scenes, each constructed as a non-narrative. It is neither the life of the martyrs that are displayed, nor their public working or heavenly reward, but rather the moment of the brutal executions. And actually, if we take the entire 18 scenes, we have like a moving decapitation of one saint. Like you have all the stages, one after the other. For example, St. James the Greater is already decapitated. His head here is about to roll out of the niche, and in his spontaneous last resort, so to speak, the saint has managed to grasp it at the very edge, infusing the entire image with instantaneity. From behind here, as if to demonstrate the banality of the evil doing, the executioners indifferently wipes the sword with his cloak. And this is actually in contrary to any medieval tradition. Usually it is the saints who is very calm and the executioners who is very expressive. Comparing these images with the mid-13th century statues from Reims, for example, reveal the shift in pictorial language of the Edmond cycle. And here you see again a decapitated figure, whereas Saint Nicaise here is restrained, stable, calmly holding his head, while angels here are crowning his severed stamp. St. James the Greater is suffering, spontaneous, and humiliated, whereas St. Nicaise's upright posture testifies to his dignity and victory over death. The kneeling of James disempowers him, degrading him to a submissive posture, and thereby, as noted by Bernd Shaw, emasculating him. The next to him is St. Simon, his skull split, here, see, very graphical, while the murderer replaces its sword to its scabbard. Another pagan pierces the breast of Matthew. Judas Thaddeus is being clapped to death. This depiction shows the very moment before the blow is struck. The perpetrator waves the clap while Judas, passive, submissive, and obedient, accepts his subjugation. The sculpture is designed to be viewed from several angles. While from the side view one witnesses the executions, the front view reveals the psychological tension between victim and executioner. The gaze and aggression of the murderer is directed toward the viewer, who becomes an active participant in the event, while Judas invites compassion. This is a religious practice of how you express your identification with the suffering of Christ or other saints. Even more terrifying is the figure of St. James the Lesser, who is portrayed at the very moment when the axe, here you see, strikes and penetrates his skull, a practice that does not belong to his martyrdom, but rather to medieval battlefield, those who throw the axe on the enemy. The wooden handle here, it's a real wood, intensify even further the realistic appearance of the sculpture and its association to medieval warfare. What, therefore, would the contemporary viewer have understood from such images? Having no halos that would mark them as saints, were they perceived as martyrs or as executed criminals? In short, the spectator is confronted with extreme and direct brutality, stripped of any narrative context, in a gallery of isolated images of violent act. Although it is tempting to relate this simply to the imitation of Christ, martyrdom had never previously been portrayed in such a manner. Moreover, such galleries of violence are prevalent in many of the parlor enterprises unconnected with the Passion. For example, the Church of St. Theobald in Thann features approximately 40 martyr scenes. St. Apollonia's teeth are being yanked, Erasmus' nails are ripped out, St. Paul is about to lose his head, St. Emmeram is being chopped to pieces, hand and feet. And finally, just examples, Cain, progenitor of all transgressors, appears in the role of the executioners, while Abel is lying here on a rock submissively. And actually, this is an interesting connection between the first murderer and the violent history of humanity. Comparable images appear in illustrated legal treatises, such as the 14th century Fleur de Chronique, which demonstrate the rituals and technique of legal executions. Chopping off the hands of forgers here appears almost identical to the image of St. Emmeram. Decapitation of the Lord of Rouen and the execution with the axe of Nicolas Le Flamand are composed similarly to Cain killing Abel, and there are many more examples. These images can hardly be distinguished from the martyrdom scenes in terms of iconography and syntax. Both shows a series of extremely violent behavior. It therefore seems reasonable to assume that the parlor sculptural imagery evoked in the spectator's memory the contemporaneous practices of executions and contemporary reality of violence or practices of punishments. In his seminal study on power, identity, body, and body in the Passion of the Martyrs, Brenshaw has demonstrated the inversion of values and transgender paradigms inherent in martyrs' narrative. Kneeling, submission, and the spectacle of suffering effeminize the male martyrs. For the persecutors, the display of violent power over subject bodies was intended to produce truth, while the audience voyeuristically enjoyed the spectacle of pain, power, and authority. The persecutor commands, the martyrs obey. Yet, it was through their very submissions and feminization that the persecutor were forced to admit their defeat and the superiority of the tortured body. The endurance of torture in itself, however, was only one facet of the moral triumph. It was the public face of such endurance that mattered. Such spectacles, and a few examples of violence, however, had originally been orchestrated through the eyes of the pagans. How then might this have been perceived by the 14th century spectators? Did they even conceive them as violent? For Caroline Bynum, she's one of the most important scholars of theology, this was certainly not the case. Bynum argues that late medieval imagery of partition and bloodshed is not violent. Accordingly, in the religious belief of late medieval Europe, wound and mutilated organs are about access to the body of Christ and participation in it. Disfigured figures are not reflection of violent society, but rather they constitute a religiosity of blame and self-reproach in which suffering was experienced as a form of ecstasy and love, evoking the sacrifice of Christ. The so-called violent imagery, in Bynum's opinion, is not violent in the modern sense of the word, which implies negative meaning, but rather as a positive one, associating by inversion joy, love, comfort, and hope. Her interpretation echoes the Augustinian dichotomy between body and soul. a system in which violent act executed upon the body was compared to the pain of medical surgery. Perceived as such, physical violence possessed healing qualities and was therefore moralistic and conceived as positive. Negative violence was that which was enacted upon the soul. According to Augustine, because the dead body does not suffer in hell, the soul, being internal, is the one which suffers in the purgatory. Sensory pain is therefore a function of the soul and not of the body. The human soul comprises a similitude of the body, which is the part that suffers in hell. Only after the resurrection and the reunification of body and soul will sensory pain will reside in the body. Until then, violent acts that harm the soul and impair its prospect for salvation are what constitute genuine cruelty. Such violence is therefore reflexive because it can be committed by a person against his or his own soul and is not necessarily interpersonal violence. Actually, after Augustine, during the entire Middle Ages, there is no systematic, moralistic, ethical, or theological discussion about the meaning of violence, and the first discussion is at the end of the 13th century. And also the vocabulary is very vague about what violent is. Although binum analysis has become almost canonical by now, it raises many methodological as well as hermeneutic heuristic problems. It seems to constitute a new disguise for the anachronistic notion that medieval people were desensitized to physical violence, relating it a kind of an exotic aura. Bainu, moreover, discussed artworks that display emotional, devotional, or calm emotions, whereas many images that I discuss here reveal direct pain, suffering, and violence. A crucial paradigm in the study of literature, art history, and many other disciplines that can be used to differentiate this image from earlier ones lies in the emphasis on graphical brutality and the technicality of violence. Elaine Scarry, for example, observed that another's pain is incomprehensible and unshareable. In order to identify with the pain of the other, one needs a linguistic metaphor that will locate the pains within a specific place and instrument. In our representation, not only the locus clearly pronounced, but so too are the tool of pain, swords, pincers, and so on. Moreover, Valentin Gröbner has shown how violence renders its victim anonymity, making them nameless, historyless, pure examples of horrors. It is intriguing that in spite of the stark naturalistic tendency of late Gothic art, the deformed and defaced martyrs, the ungestalten figures in Gmund and Tann, lack any individual qualities. This is reinforced by their expropriation for the narrative of their private life. Their individual stories as well as their attributes are minimized, and the representation does not conform to any conventional formulation in medieval art, which brings a problem of memory. How would anyone identify the specific martyr if it is not depicted in the conventions? Other images, for example, of the period, such as those in Vienna Cathedral, also by the parlor sculpture, adhere to fairly conventional depictions of the martyrs identified by their attributes. Those in Gmund and Tann, which I showed here, in this respect, depart from such moderate configuration in favor of what seems to me to be an experimental violence. As articulated by Jody Anderson, and I will be soon back to all these images that we haven't discussed yet. As articulated by Jody Anders, the emphasis on the sheer cruelty of the martyrdom decontextualizes the act from its religious content. It's okay? You still hear me? Or? No? Okay, so you should have told me that. Okay, I apologize. As articulated by Jody Anders, the emphasis on the sheer cruelty of the martyrdom decontextualizes the act from its religious content and creates thereby a spectacle of violence. For the contemporaneous observer, the initial encounter with this gallery of defaced figures, not yet encoded in any pictorial tradition, must have been experienced as something totally new, thereby postponing the moment of inversion and devotional sublimation so cherished by Bainum. In his study on medieval cruelty, Daniel Baraz explored the new attitudes toward body, cruelty, and violence prevailing in late medieval century Thomistic thought, reconciling the Augustinian dichotomy and rejecting the notion of impassibility. Impassibility is your ability not to feel pain. Aquinas maintained that the soul is the form of the body. This coherency and transparency between appearance and essence, body and soul, matter and spirit, suggests that such imagery should not be read within merely metaphorical devotional system, but rather that what one sees is what there is. In other words, emotionally moving violence. Violence as subject per se in late medieval art raises many problems that have yet to be resolved. Images are always involved with image and sight theory. What, therefore, were the norms and rules of representations of violence? Were they encoded in text or in extra-textual mentality? What was the sensibility of the viewers to such images? What is the relationship between visual excess and perception? Was violent imagery considered as entertainment? Or did it invite identification through bodily response? How do images of violence relate to the reality of violence? These problems are effectively illustrated through the depiction of the torments of St. Bartholomew and St. Catherine of Alexandria, which are among the most frequent martyrdom features in numerous late medieval artwork in the German-speaking lands. It's better now with the microphone? Yeah, thank you. In Tan, St. Catherine is depicted beheaded near the wheel. Here she is. Her head, her lower part of the body, her torso falling on the ground on the lower right. At the left, here, Emperor Maxentius orders to torture the saints, while two male figures here kneels and beg for mercy in a prayer gesture. The suffering saint screams in pain, clasps her head in despair. This depiction deviates not only from her conventional representation, standing calmly by the wheel or holding it as an attribute, but also from her legend. According to the Golden Legend, the instrument of her torture was constructed from 4 iron wheels sharpened with razors and moving in opposite directions like that, designed to break her body. Miraculously, an angel of God appeared, broke the wheel, and saved the saint unharmed from these torments, as is depicted in the relief, at the top of which an angel destroyed the wheel with his swords. Only thereafter is Catherine beheaded while gladly accepting her martyrdom, praying and glorifying God. At Tan, rather than merely being decapitated, St. Catherine's entire body is shown cut into 2, thus evoking the aim of the wheel. The representation seems to merge the potential torment on the wheels with her factual death. The viewer is thus confronted with her martyrdom, the fear of torture, and the imaginative breaking of the body that was not realized but instead visualized. Moreover, while the legend describes St. Catherine gladly accepting her decapitation, the sculpture depicts her cry of pain. The Tan representation thus shifts the emphasis of the conventional portrayal of St. Catherine from impassibility of martyrdom to the body suffering violence. Such deviations provide us with insight into the response of the viewers. For example, in the reliquary shutters of Guido da Siena, Catherine is bound to a wooden beam here, her hands and legs tied to prevent her escape. 2 executioners are turning the wheel while its razors here tear at the bleeding flesh of the martyr. 2 male figures are witnessing the event. One of them clasps his hand and bends his head in sorrow, while the other lays his hand on his companion's shoulder as if to comfort him, indicating to the viewers the proper mode of response. Breaking of the body on the wheel was a popular punishment in the civic court and familiar to the contemporary viewer. The depiction, nonetheless, differs from the contemporary breaking on the wheel in which the body was crisscrossed, as here, through the rims, and then with the open wounds, it was just in the open air that the birds will intensify the torture until he was bleeding to death. Catherine's martyrdom was therefore concurrently tangible and imagined, embodying the unrealized torture and the knowledge and imagination and experience of the viewers. A similar tragedy, evoking the imaginary horizons of the viewers, also characterizes the representation of Bartholomew. Stefan's Luchner Apostle Retable features early Christian martyrs in contemporary costumes, presenting a wide range of executions in various visual rhetoric. The assemblage of martyrs probably reflects Dominican piety and religiosity of self-inflicted pain and the cult of local venerated saints, while revealing a brutal parade of violence. The images are going to be gruesome. The torments of St. Bartholomew is perhaps the most striking of them all. While the king's clerk, probably a Jew here, supervises the executions, 4 tenors are flaying St. Bartholomew alive. 2 of them are using a knife to separate between legs and skin, while in the back plane, a 3rd professional tanner is detaching the skin with great efforts, using the weight of his body as he bent backwards as he flayed the saint's arm. To his left, a 4th tenor is about to pour a maceration to cleanse the skin as if preparing a parchment. The depiction is terrifying. The saint's body is red and bleeding, while an additional set of arms, that of the flayed skin here, hangs loosely from his body. This iconographical type was first formulated at the end of the 13th century, and its earliest known depiction is attributed again to Guido da Siena's panel, which depicts double set of legs and arms hanging down while the tenors toil at the walk, and in the more iconic image at Schwäbisch Gmund, in which the skin here flows outward toward the real space of the spectator. The canonical legend of St. Bartholomew does not clearly report either the exact nature of his martyrdom or his response to the torment. After a long discussion, the author summarizes. There are various opinions about the kind of the death that Bartholomew suffered. This disagreement can be resolved by saying that he was crucified, then, before he died, taken down, and, to intensify his suffering, flayed alive, and finally, his head cut off. These are only 3, the list is much longer in the Golden Legend. The Middle High German version of the legend, however, recounts that King Astrogas commanded that the saint be beaten with a club and then flayed alive. Perhaps due to the ambiguity of the earlier sources, the iconography of Bartholomew martyrdom developed relatively late. With the appearance of the German version, however, portrayals of his flame began to flourish. Moreover, and this is even more terrifying here, the local version also connected the saints with the healing of leprosy. I don't know if you can see the details from the back, but if we had a good projector, you could see that you can see really the anatomy of the flesh. I don't know how to describe it. And his flame became a visual evidence to his unique healing powers, an idea which appears to have inspired the depiction of the raw flesh here, seemingly half flayed, half infected with leprosy. The martyrdom of Bartholomew and Catherine provided the devotees many points of references to the realities of late medieval punishment, while equally evoking an imaginative somatic dimension. In the case of Bartholomew, the executioners are depicted as professional tenors processing his skin into a vellum, and the representation appears to be a concrete and accurate depiction of the process. It also brings to mind the medieval punitive system. During the late Middle Ages, the first monitoring and recording system arose in the town of Europe, providing detailed reports of violent behavior within the city walls and establishing criteria for quantifying and conceptualizing violence. Decollation, for example, was preserved for crimes committed by the aristocracy against the state, such as treason. Dragging by horses was the punishment for well-known criminals. Impaling or life burial for rapists, boiling for sodomists, or for those who attempted suicide, while breaking on the wheel was a punishment for many crimes from simple theft to murder, but from 1362 it was especially kept for traitors. Flaying alive was by far the most terrifying punishment in medieval and early modern Europe. In his study on medieval law, William Barron argues that flaying was a rare penalty in medieval reality, relying more on old traditions than on formal law. In most cases, the realization of flaying sentence was eventually avoided. In fact, only one case of flaying is documented in the Middle Ages. Flaying was considered terrifying not only because of the physical pain it caused, but also since the skin was regarded as protective boundary between the external and the internal, and as representing a cloth or vellum on which the human identity was written. Paradoxically, because it was only seldom performed and constituted an extreme shocking experience for the public, it stirred the medieval imagination and featured frequently in vernacular writings and the collective memory. Bearing in mind the gap between the actual, infrequent flaying in medieval society versus its prominent place in the contemporary literature, human flaying was more imagined than reality for the viewers. St. Catherine's suffering, in contrast, is constructed otherwise. While torments on the wheel were deeply anchored in the medieval punishment system, the scene seems to materialize as the imagined suffering of which the saint was in fact spared. Here, the portrayed terrified audience materialized the contemporary fear of violence. In both cases, the torment refers concomitantly to the saint's life, juridical reality, and the viewer's imagination. These particular scenes, which are often entwined in late medieval art, were probably experienced somatically as highly threatening for the bodily integrity of the contemporary viewer. Such representation could move the viewers from the theological to the juridical and bodily concerns regarding violence, allowing multiple and varying readings, including disgust and fear of physical violence. So I will shorten a little bit my talk. During the 14th century opera, violence appeared as a moral problem not only in religious and legal treatises, but also in the aristocratic Schöne Sitte. This is the book of good manners and the aristocratic courtly behavior. Here, violence emerged for the first time as a moral allegory. The violent man is in tort, while wickedness hangs in blame and misfortune. Violence is not included in the cardinal sins. It's the first time that he appears as a figure. The violent man complains, "You are giving me the blame." The text read, "You should pay attention that a man will be considered accursed when he acts all the time with violence, and blame and misfortune will stick to him. The one who suffers violence is not to be blamed, and therefore, as ordained by nature, has no impurity." Until that time, more or less, also the people that suffered violence were somehow guilty, especially in sexual crime. The violence imagery could thus offer a visual discourse on the new moral and ethical system that characterizes the cities along the upper and the middle Rhine. And actually, populist views tend to directly correlate or relate violent society to violent imagery. Actually, it's vice versa. And late medieval martyr imagery in the German-speaking space offers the viewers a great many images that cannot be easily accommodated in any text or memory scheme. For example, several martyrs are shown with their heads being sawn off. It has until now, no literal known source. Others are being clapped to death with amputated legs of animals, and others still with sticks and swords slashing their veins. All these were novel images not yet encoded in the visual tradition. Moreover, this accumulation of images into galleries of violence found along the upper and the middle Rhineart, whether in stained glass windows here in Freiburg and Niederhaslach or around the South Germany and Alsace, public monumental altarpieces, private panels. This is a very small piece in that size in Cologne. Depict one of the earliest depictions of the martyrdom of the 10,000. Here's some details. Another depiction of the martyrdom of Agatha, of Catherine cutting off her breast, and you see the knives really wounding her breast, or her flagellation, or decapitation. and in, of course, monumental sculpture or others. This accumulation of images provided a new visual experience, postponing the moment of cathartic devotional inversion. Medieval representation, as noted by Mary Carruthers, was a sign system that recalled and interacted with and on memory. Images were stored in memory, available for reaction. The viewers were probably expected to call in mind the memory of the entire Passion narrative when viewing only the dramatic culmination of the saint torment. Nevertheless, for the medieval viewer, the initial encounter with such galleries of tormented figures, not yet encoded in pictorial tradition, to be enacted through memory, escalating between the imagined and the real, between devotional and corporeal, between theological and juridical position, must have been experienced as something totally new, violently shocking, incorporating imaginative bodies and bodily imagination in the process of making images understandable. To conclude, late medieval violent imagery did not exist merely in symbolic order. As already noted, from the 14th century, the first monitoring system around in the town of Central Europe, establishing criteria for quantifying violence. The civic milieu was also the place where the heroic bearing of pain was replaced by new sensibility to it. Similarly, from the 14th century on, the visual arts seems to have produced their own records of violent behavior. I do not claim that violent imagery reflects, produces, reproduces, or constitutes reality. An understanding of its aesthetics and semiotics, however, might reveal to us the contemporaneous extra-religious and extra-textual notion of violence. While admitting multiple readings of the martyrdom relief as relating to devotional practices, relic claims, and the theological discourse on the fragmented body, I comprehend this imagery as conducting a visual discourse on what violence is as both moral and ethical problem, and suggest that violence as a category is what appear here for the first time as a subject for artistic speculations. The visual discourse on violence goes hand by hand with the new ideas on bodily integrity and the wholeness of the body as advocated by Aquinas and his followers in the Dominican schools along the upper and middle Rhine. While in the Latin West, the human body was considered in Christian thought as a social property belonging to the community or to God, and therefore constantly exposed to external uses and attack. From the 14th century on, it was first regarded in Christian culture as the private property of the individual. Together with the domestic formulation of the equality of the body and soul, this new attitude resulted in the redefinition of the boundaries of one's body in relation to the other. Once the body became private, the issue arose of violence and the legitimacy to harm the body of the other. In the Middle High German language, the word Gewalt first attained its modern meaning as violence, Gewalttätigkeit, in this period. Until then, it just was big or huge. Similarly, the Latin noun violentia, too, received its first discourse and meaning since Roman's time as a negative category in the moral discussion at the end of the 13th century. Violence as such is therefore a kind of invention of late medieval culture. In a more radical sense, my study, this is an ongoing project, my study contends that this new system, new systematic discussion on violence that appeared during the 14th century in the civic milieu was the constitutive moment of the pre-modern individuality that drawn the line between the public body and the private one. Confronting the viewer with visual aggression, the plastic arts interrogated these issues, responding, reflecting, and conducting their own visual discourse on what violence is. Thank you.
Thank you, Assaf, for this, what should we say, provocative talk on violence. I guess we should open for discussion, questions, comments.
Criticism. Yes, please.
A question that towards the beginning you were talking about the healing properties of suffering in the period before.
Yeah. So from, yes, please.
So I was just wondering if you could expand a little bit.
Yeah, since Augustine actually is related also to Tertullian and Hieronymus' theology of suffering as surgery or healing process. He compares like the violence act to cutting off the hand of someone whose hand is already infected. And he says you cut the hand to heal the body. So the sufferer has positive meaning. And Augustine, Tertullian, and so on actually disconnect bodily and bodily suffer, physical suffer from the body and locate it therefore in the soul, and they disconnect it with the negative associations that were given to violent act in Roman moral discussion. And so they created a new total theology of body and pain, in which the real pain is only passive. Like if you harm your chances to be for your salvation, like if you will deny Christ, this is violence. This is how he denies violence. Because when you deny Christ, you deny your salvation. After the 14th century. Well, I would say that this imagery continued to flourish until the 16th century, and then but it's changed entirely its subject and topics, and it is much more related, for example, to pogroms. Many images that relate to attacks on Jewish families from the 16th century are widely documented in artwork, and spectacle of the crucifixion, not of the martyrs, also related to the realities of penalty and to the realities of violence. So it's changed its aim. And also, for example, in 15th century and 16th century Florence, such images were used for a new kind of legal system. They are called pittura infamante, pictures of shame. And for example, if you could, in many cases, For example, if a criminal was doomed to cut his nose, so they wouldn't really cut his nose, but they will put a painting of him and will cut the nose of the painting. Okay? Or if the criminal escaped the city, they will hang from the town hall a huge painting of the punishment that he would have been suffered if he would be caught. Yeah, so it has like, it becomes really like legal propaganda on the one hand, and on the other hand, change of topics to programs and so on. Okay?
Yeah.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. I'm interested in thinking about violence and truth and sovereignty and what's going on here. So a comparison that was helping me think through was thinking about Jewish tradition and Kabbalah in relation to truth and justice. So in Jewish tradition, there's a semiotic relationship between violence and God, or El and Alimut, but there's also a connection between truth and death, Net and Emet.
Mm-hmm.
So in a sense, I'm wondering, in this context, what's the relationship between the Christian theology at play and truth at stake? So the opposite connection is between the original crucifixion of Christ and the repetition of the sacrifice. But on the other hand, there's a particular form of justice being performed. So I guess the thoughts are a bit jumbled, but what's the relationship between the particular Christian theology as it's being kind of co-opted for a particular form of popular justice on the level of the body?
Okay, so first I must apologize. Although I'm from Hasidic family, I don't know enough the Jewish Kabbalah or theology, if you can call it like that. So I will not comment on the Jewish side of the thing. Martyrdom is basically connected with revealing truth. Like it's, you know, the suffering of pain, the impassibility shows how God actually write his identity on your body and manifest it to the entire community. The fact that you are supposed to cry and that you suffer, and you know, women like Katerina, Agatha are not only decapitated, they have like 6 or 7 torments, like cutting off the breast, the tongue, whatever, the nails, everything comes together. So, and their ability to bear the suffer is testimony to the truth of their faith. The problem in this imagery that before the 14th century, you have really the entire narrative and testimony of Christian faith. But here you actually have like a new formulation focused only in the torments. And the question arises, do these images, as you rightly pointed out, are related also now to revealing of truth? Because you don't see the moment of this revelation. And I have no answer to that, and this is why I try to disconnect them from just devotional system to more civic, juridical, and moral discussions, and not they appear, of course, in churches. But what happens when the people have no hallows? You don't know exactly what's the plan, because you saw this yesterday in the civic market during executions, and you can't really anymore relate the specific torments to specific saints. You know, the connection that I've shown here are almost speculative. Well, Katerina is not speculative, and Bartholomew is not speculative, but all the others, we cannot really say who is who. So again, the relation between revealing truth and martyrdom is being somehow in doubt, I think. And this is why I think the new emphasis is about the individuality, integrity, bodily integrity, and so on.
So a follow-up on this, Assaf. So one thing is that you emphasize the way in which there's an expression of the suffering as opposed to resignation to the pain. But it seems to me that what's key is the violence, and that the images of the suffering and are only there to intensify the momentum of the violence, and that in fact the experience of the martyr is kind of less it seems to me, less central in these figures than these terrible acts of violence that are competing with each other to be more and more violent. So I wonder, and this goes to Ian's question, whether. So one thing is to say this is not about religion at all. This is about the.
No, I didn't say that.
Okay.
It's always come with devotional system. It's in the church.
So the question is, maybe there's a contrast here between the worldly powers and their senseless violence in war, even in sovereignty, punishment. So that what we see here is we don't see the other half of the story. The other half of the story would be that in God's world, things don't look like this, but that there's a strong image here of this, something of the senselessness of the violence when you're not within the realm of true religion, or right. So that in fact it's kind of creating a distance between the juridical and the political and the religious by showing these very strong images of violence and creating in one's image. Okay, this is, you identify with the martyr by saying we don't, this violence is worldly, whereas we seek our refuge somewhere else. And it's not so much in the images of the martyr, but rather in what you imagine about where this violence is coming from. I don't want to offer a competing reason, but I'm trying to think of how this is supposed to work in the context of the church.
It is, well, what I suggest is multiple reading and the discrepancy between intentionalism and reception. It's not always the same. Well, for the clergies, of course, there are images of these are images of faith in one way or another, and they do reveal truth. But for the audience, and this is the question of reception, I'm not sure, well, because if you read, for example, these specific images are from Tan, and in Tan, during the Annals of Tan during the 14th century, have many tales on which you cannot choose even the chronics of this is Franciscan Annals, and they, on the one hand, they report about current martyrdom in the cities, like there are wars and many Christians are dying for in the name of Christ, and they are called martyrs in the chronics. And on the other hand, the most prominent issue in those chronics from the mid 14th century, like 1351 to 1392 or 5, I don't remember if it ended at 2 or 5, is the problems of crimes in the city. So these images are like double-oriented and can always be read in two different systems, because I cannot say if this was intentionally planned as such by the clergies, but we also don't know who actually produced them and what were the limitation given by the clergies. Because, I mean, if there is new formulation, who conceptualized it? The commissioners, the artists? We don't know those issues in the Middle Ages. But the only thing that we can reflect is that problems of, of reception and supposed intentionalism.
So can we collect two questions and conclude? Ulioa and George.
Okay, maybe it's just a repetition. I was interested in this point of how violence in these images of the martyr, how their individuality, their individual story is cut out, and you are left with just the image of violence. And it's related to me. A colleague of mine had researched here about the difference of reception or imagery of the Holocaust in religious, ultra-religious communities in Israel. They refuse this focusing on the violence, on the gas and so forth, and they go back to the work of the people, or to the book they have written and so forth, insisting on their individuality, on their life, as what is important to remember, as opposed to the moment in which you cannot individuate one. And so for me, it raised, while secular Holocaust memory is more and more focused on this violence and on this. So
but not third generation, not the third generation. Anyone?
Yes and no, because I read a lot, and this is a lot of so I wonder here, because this is again a religious context, and it goes against the official memory.
Is it okay if we take another question, or you're going to lose track because we need to conclude soon? So. Okay.
Yes. Shouldn't I answer? Just a very short answer. It might come as a surprise. No, but it's not. The Christian self is defined by suffering. So it's Christ, but not always. I mean.
Yes. So no, but here the martyrs lose their individuality.
Yeah, but they didn't have individuality from the beginning. I mean, the entire Vita are a formula that repeats itself. And if you really read, and you know, they choose, you can say that the tertiary is the individuality. For example, Bartholomew, his head was cut off and all the thing, but flame was like what identified him. So like the torture and the torment became the definition of their individuality, I think. The body. Yeah, so it's through the body and suffering. It's a new definition, I think.
Jordan? Will be the last.
One of the parts I'm still not getting is sort of what's transitioning, what's different in the appraisal of violence, and maybe to put the question with two parts. First, a contrast. So you say Christian self is defined by suffering. So that a central teaching, Jesus, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross.
This is the imitatio Christi. You should identify, and there is meditation practices that you will suffer as him, and that you will get also the stigmata.
So suffering does play this redemptive role, both with respect to Christ and the one who suffers with Christ.
Yeah.
And that's present, so you have these strange scenes of violence, in turn from first century to second, the verbal images of martyrs, and then the crowd, say, running down in an arena to get a body part of a martyr that, so this kind of embracing of the one suffering violence in some way as a part of the witness for Christ. This is from the beginning through this period and after.
Yeah.
And then in interpreting the suffering, so the image, say the medical metaphor that you mentioned with Augustine, but also as part of that, so for Augustine, all evil generally is a privation of the good. So it's part of a more general account of good. Good is what's positive, what we positively define. Evil necessarily can only be defined as an absence of the good. It can't be positively presented. Now that doesn't mean that there is no violence. It seems what's taken for granted in all of these scenes from the beginning and through this is this is a state that people take as sort of self-evidently bad initially to be in. And part of its function being presented in this way is to say, if this suffering is for Christ, it gives a way to make meaning of these self-evidently bad events. So I'm still not capturing what is that decisive difference with respect to violence that's associated with the presentation of these images and the analysis of them that wouldn't, since you have these images of violence going all the way back, the general frame, for Aquinas as well, right, it's a privation, not constituted. I'm not capturing what...
You're asking me about the visual evidence, or about I'm not sure that I followed the question. So because most images of martyrs from the 5th, 6th century on are not about martyrdom, are about their heavenly reward. There appears in full body, they have no attributes of their martyrdom, and they are in heaven in Christ. So they are after the salvation. Only in the 12th century, the Christian monumental art starts to depict their stories, with the martyrdom as the end of the story, but not as the main point. It's just after the preaching, interrogation in jail, being before the Roman ruler, and so on, and they died at the end, but it's not the main point. And so if you come to a church, you can see 1 or 2 life of saints, nothing more than that, because there are 18 sins of each saint. And suddenly, in those churches at the 14th century, the entire concept is changed. Instead of showing a story, they are just showing executions. Many of the executions are not, cannot be found in the legends, also not in the local legends, at least what survived, but on the other end, they are found in daily practices, like war, like execution, and so on. So this is a very important shift. At the same time, what I try to demonstrate is that this shift goes hand by hand with the new conceptualization of the body, not being lower ranked than the soul, but being equal, and bringing back the pain to the body, and all the new moral discussion and the civic legal discussion that try to define what violence is. Another example, if you read just a short, the Chronics, and which depicts really a huge massacre, and then they end that there was no gentle man as this night, and first they describe how he kills everyone, cuts the noses, cut the ears, and so on, and they say he was so gentle and so good and so on. So there is no differentiation between if the violent has a purpose, it is not negatively. Only in the 14th century, the discussion begins about the negative aspects of violence, and whether and how much power I am allowed to enact upon the body of the other. And I think that the visual arts always responds and partakes in the same concern that are manifested in literal sources, in theological, especially at the age when the most important mode of communication was visual and not literal.
Thank you so much. So let's take a 10-minute break and resume. And thank you, Assaf.